Hey everybody, welcome back to the Restart Pod. Today, we've done this dance before. Big open source model comes out, spooks all the benchmarks. This happened like a year and like 2-ish months ago with DeepSeek. Kimi K3 just came out and just did it. So I'll share, mind you, this news is like 2 business days old already. So there's been a lot of reaction to it. The stuff I'm sharing right now is from the Twitter feed of what seems like some consideration from the government to ban Chinese open source models in the US. For color, it's not crushing per se, but it's surpassing Fable and this like GPT 5.6 models on a number of coding benchmarks. The ones that stuck out to me were specifically front end related stuff. But the thing that's strange, and I think the same conversation that we had a year and a half ago was one of the token efficiency on this is really, really great. It's performing at similar levels, and it has the whole industry spooked again about where the value is captured in the frontier labs, how you avoid this happening, especially since the time between DeepSeek and Soda at the time was maybe a month or two, whereas this was maybe 6 days after Fable decided we can broadly make our model available to folks.
Yeah, I guess first off, many thoughts. I think jumping into the ban, I think the thing that most immediately triggered in my brain was the comparison between Kimi K3 that's being done and Claude Fable and to some degree GPT 5.6. It's an important note that I haven't actually seen anybody make yet, although I'm sure others are thinking about it, that this is the third worst version of Fable, at least, meaning there was a Fable Mythos that was released in preview only to select folks that the public never got access to.
Yeah.
There was the first rollout of Fable that got the export band control on. Then there's the third iteration of Fable that now everybody can use, and that is the
Right.
kind of, participant in these benchmark tests. The question, I guess, in my mind is if we could run Fable or Mythos without guardrails, like we can run Kimi K3, how much better does that Fable / Mythos model perform? Maybe none at all, maybe a lot. I don't know. That's you know what I'm saying. What I'm asking the question is we're kind of getting a nerfed, some would argue for good reason, but a nerfed in any event version of both of those models from the Frontier Labs. And the question to me is, how much better are the unnerfed, non-nerfed, whatever the version is? You know what I'm saying?
Right.
How much better could that model be?
I didn't thought about that. I do think that there is I think there's a wider conversation of not a wider conversation, but like a branch of that thread that you just introduced, that if the models that are being released for general enterprises to use are not going to be the Mythos class, we would assume that most of the inference spend is going to be on the Fable tier anyway. And so we enter this sort of dance of like, what is the export controlled version? What is the government approved version? Now that Trump is considering a ban on the Chinese models, all that kind of stuff. There is a nuance, I guess, the thing that you're asking, that I think it's an interesting question, but I'm suspect about how much it ends up actually mattering in the macroeconomics of the whole
Correct.
thing. If the general population is using a Fable tier model and the Mythos tier model isn't driving enough volume to compete with how much volume Fable ends up driving.
Totally agreed. I think the thing that I want to remark on and kind of open for discussion is when things like this happen, when the DeepSeek moment happened, when this call it Kimi K3 moment just happened, the thing that triggers in my brain is how many of my previous biases do I need to re-underwrite, right? What biases need to be updated based on this new information, if any, right? Sometimes it's none, but sometimes it's a lot. The thing that I am continuously thinking through, I had previously held the fairly firm opinion that the reason that open source could rapidly catch up to frontier capabilities was largely due to distillation. We had, before this announcement, never seen on any even reasonably, acknowledged benchmark, seen the open source hop the frontier.
Right.
This is the first time we have ever seen, at least again, kind of in public consciousness, seen an open source model hop the frontier on any benchmark. We can argue whether or not this benchmark is great. We can argue whether or not it's highly relevant. It doesn't really matter. The point is that this is kind of a novel feature for the first time. But what immediately triggered in my brain was, what is K3 distilled on? We knew there were reports that Chinese model providers, we don't know which ones, had access to maybe the unreleased version of Mythos. Maybe they were able to distill it. And so the question that opened in my brain was, if we could see the full power, let's call it, Mythos model, would this be ahead of K3? And would the distillation of that more powerful model explain for the first time why we're seeing this leapfrogging? Because if the answer to that question is no, then my prior bias of distillation being the key ingredient for open source remaining competitive needs to be completely rethought, in my opinion.
Yeah, I don't know when this is going to happen, but I kind of anticipate that, especially with the culture, like, I guess the tone around the frontier labs right now and the way that enterprises are trying to lock up things. I think we're going to begin to see this sort of branching of models a little bit. That right now, the best models in the world are either coming straight out of the frontier labs or distilled from the frontier labs, illegally, generally, but happening nonetheless. I think if you look at China and Kimi and DeepSeek in general, those labs have significant government support. That I don't know how much data that they're getting fed from the government, but they should have a lot of a proprietary data wheel that is not as accessible here, right? A lot of the training that's happening is off of developer usage, but if we're going to begin to see that Kimi or DeepSeek or whatever it may be ends up being competitive with the frontier anyway, and those models begin to get used in China properly, and they get a developer adoption. We're seeing, I don't know how much of a true brain drain it is, but a lot of Chinese researchers will come here for school and then they'll go back. Historically, a lot of researchers from China will come to the labs here. But for example, one of the founders of Kimi is a CMU PhD and then went back. How common that will be, I don't know. But in general, there seems to be an opportunity that this distillation-based keep up ends up segmenting, because the amount of proprietary data that is available in the States, or I guess in the broader ecosystem of what the Frontier Labs provide as a service, is not a drying well, but it's either a neutralizing or plateauing thing. Whereas in a China first model run wheel, you end up hypothetically with government backed usage. Technically, we've seen this before, that they've been trying to provide wrappers around the Frontier Lab APIs. I assume there's less of an incentive for that if Kimi and DeepSeek become China first models, and then China developers, China pharma, China chip design, whatever it may be, starts using those models and capturing those use cases, where all of a sudden Frontier in China might not be dependent on Frontier in the States.
Yeah, I think a lot of that will play out over time. I think it's challenging to speculate on kind of the full machinations of that in present, just because I think there's a lot of moving parts. Like you said, not a lot of visibility into those. There's also impending reports on maybe DeepSeek and others possibly going public and kind of on the Chinese stock market and those kind of things. I think you're going to have other dynamics at play there. The data, advantage, data moat, whatever you want to call it, from the Chinese perspective, I think is an interesting touch point. I think there's also embedded in this. I'll kind of screen share for effect here, but embedded in this report. So this is kind of the one that I'm talking about, where for the first time, some reasonable third party benchmark had Kimi K3 not just as good as, but in fact better than the frontier models, namely Fable 5 and then GPT 5.6. I think the interesting thing to call back on is we often quip that you don't need Opus to center a div.
Right.
This is kind of funny that what we're now talking about being kind of the, second DeepSeek moment being Kimi K3 centering divs better than, Fable. Right. So I think there's something interesting to be kind of thought about there. But I think in the general sense, the more important thing for me is competition is great. I think there are dynamics that we have to think thoughtfully about how we want to proceed both as a nation and an industry. Like I think, the incentives of just the tech sector itself will have slightly different incentives than the nation at large. But to me, this is why I'm so bullish on AI in general. Like we haven't even really begun to see the ceiling of capability for any of these things. Now, I think you could make the legitimate argument that this announcement is bad for the valuation of the frontier labs. I think that's a perfectly reasonable take to have, right? Like, does the value stop accruing to Anthropic and OpenAI? I'm still fundamentally of the opinion no, but I think that's a reasonable take. I find it very challenging in moments like this to figure out how you would make the case for the AI bubble, though, candidly. Like, it's just in the event where even if the two biggest companies in the space currently do go bust, to continue with the analogy, there are so many now open source Thinking Machine Labs has their stuff coming online. We haven't even really had a public release from SSI really to date. Who knows what they're up to? All that to say, there are so many options for intelligence, and we can talk about, kind of the various pros and cons of all of those options. But the fact that these things aren't topping out on benchmarks, even the most powerful models can't complete really very much of our use cases at all, just tells me we have so much room to run down so many different vectors. It's hard to be anything but, I think, optimistic and inspired by this progress. But again, with the complications as well.
Yeah, I think like public markets might have like a spooked reaction that will last for a little bit of time. I think the problem is that the general retail investor and even institutional investor, we're still not far away. We're still a ways away from the way that SF and Twitter talks about what AI is capable of achieving to the average enterprise or the average organization being able to materialize that idea. And with that difference, I think there is a wider sentiment from the very investory type of people that is, hey, y'all are yapping up value effectively. This is mostly an immaterial, fictitious thing that you all are talking about. And in some parts, that's like an application problem. That's a feature of the way of adopting this technology is still lacking some modernity, I think, for what SF does and what Twitter does. But to that end, I think in looking at how the market plays out, it's bad for the current frontier labs. Like it's a con that Kimi is able to keep up this quickly. Yes. But as you kind of alluded to, there are enough players now that like the battlefield is much more feudal than it is like singularly monarchic per se, right? There's multiple players, all of whom are compute constrained. You shared the thing today that even YC is trying to get a compute cluster online for their startups, that there is nowhere near enough supply of the bottlenecking factors that if everyone could have it their way, we'd be like spawning and conjuring more power, more data centers, more compute for any given use case. And right now we simply cannot. We can't imagine where things are going to go, but the application space will eventually catch up. The compute like infrastructure limitations should eventually catch up, and things would hopefully quote unquote normalize by that point.
Yeah, I mean, just to illustrate the point you're making, like Kimi, as of when was this? Yesterday, basically said to the effect of the demand for Kimi K3 has been so much that we can't keep up. We don't have compute, available to serve this model at the capacity that folks are now demanding it. And this has kind of been my, I think, anchored opinion for a while now, is that unlike other previous bubbles, we are supply constrained in such an asymmetric fashion that demand just simply can't outpace it. Again, this is not to say that like OpenAI and Anthropic continue to raise money and continue to do well in a vacuum. It's just like all the things that you outlined, I think, are correct, but none of those argue to me why NVIDIA, as an example, should be down in price. Right? If anything, they argue the opposite. And so, like from the investor class, from the folks that are crunching these numbers on a fundamental principle basis, I think if you want to pull money out of the model layer, I can see that argument. Pulling dollars out of the infrastructure chip hyperscalers layer, to me, is it's a tenuous argument at
Right.
best. I think it's a lot of just like charts can't go up forever, and therefore there has to be a top, and we're just trying to time, which is fine. It's a dangerous game of speculation, but I think it's fine. But I just don't think any of the data on the ground actually backs up that we are anywhere near peak AI usage. Let's call it that.
Yeah, it's the sort of thing that I'd imagine like the investor who's being specifically bullish Anthropic or bearish OpenAI, like having very opinionated stances on one of the labs at a time is probably in a pretty risky spot just because, again, it's so fluid and a very multiplayer market. But underneath all of those players is ultimately what is a platform of infrastructure. And if that infrastructure is supply constrained at like every single level and everybody wants it to grow in the like multiplayer playground, that seems pretty safe-ish. But again, I think pending there will be a retail reaction to this sort of thing that feels a little bit misplaced, but that feels like a short term symptom rather than a longer term opinionation that's pending a correction on the tone around AI in the world and tone around data centers and all that sort of stuff. In case we're up there. Thank you all for joining. We'll catch you all soon enough. Peace.